I don't understand how I make $34 an hour.
The high cost of living is forcing some older Americans back into the workforce.
Groceries are crazy now. 2 bags of groceries for $100.
I can't afford the American dream with what we wanted when we were young. It's not something really our kids can afford.
The American dream, what once symbolized opportunity and upward mobility, is now slipping out of reach for millions. The idea that if you work hard, play by the rules, and save diligently, you can achieve a stable, comfortable life? For most Americans, it feels like a cruel illusion.
So I need to come up with $4,000 by April 20th in order to secure a cheaper apartment that I'm looking into.
Inflation has surged by 35.5% over the past 12 years, while wages have stagnated. The Consumer Price Index jumped from 224.939 in 2011 to 304.702 in 2023. That's not just an abstract metric, it's a reflection of grocery bills, rent checks, and gas prices rising far faster than the paychecks used to cover them.
Prices are getting ridiculous, and I've switched where I do my shopping for food.
Here's the brutal reality. While prices soared, wages barely budged. Imagine running a race where the finish line keeps moving farther away with every step you take. That's what life feels like for most working Americans today. To understand why this happened, we need to look back. In the 1980s, something fundamental shifted in our economy. Policies began favoring corporations and investors over individuals and families. Cracks in the system were subtle at first, but over decades, they grew into fractures too big to ignore. From 2000 to 2020, the cost of housing in 88% of U.S. counties grew faster than household incomes. In other words, for nearly 9 out of 10 Americans, no matter how hard they work, they're falling behind. The average rent in the U.S. today is $1,521 per month. That's $18,252 a year. For many families, that's more than a third of their annual income. And in states like California, that number skyrockets. In San Francisco, the median rent for a one-bedroom apartment is $3,400. Think about that. $3,400 for one bedroom.
I just got a good job. I started in September, but even with that job, I still can't I can't buy anything. I can't afford the rent these days.
Across the country, young professionals are sharing their struggles, living in cars, cramming into apartments with multiple roommates, or moving back home just to survive. This isn't just about numbers. It's about a generation whose dreams are being crushed under the weight of an economy that no longer works for them. So what's going on?
We have the best economy in the world. We got to make it better. We really do have the best economy in the world.
I will end inflation, I will stop the invasion, and I will bring back the American dream.
To understand why living in the U.S. has become so difficult, we have to rewind to a time when things looked much different. After World War II, America experienced a housing boom. Government programs like the GI Bill made home ownership accessible to millions of families, and housing developments popped up across the country. But not everyone benefited equally. Redlining policies and systemic racism excluded Black and minority families from these opportunities, creating wealth disparities that persist to this day. As the decades went on, things began to change. By the 1980s, a new economic philosophy emerged, one that favored free markets and deregulation. Housing policies shifted, cutting funding for public housing and prioritizing private development. During this time, wages began to stagnate while the cost of living crept higher. Housing, healthcare, and education costs outpaced income growth, setting the stage for the affordability crisis we see today. These shifts planted the seeds of the current crisis, but the real breaking point came much later.
The housing market collapsed.
We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis.
If you are watching us from the last home you'll ever own tonight, consider yourself lucky.
2008 financial crisis. When millions of people lost their homes, giant investment firms like Blackstone swooped in and bought up properties, entire neighborhoods in some cases. These companies didn't buy homes to live in. They bought them to rent out, turning housing into a business. Today, around 20% of single-family rentals in the US are owned by big corporations. That means rents are being set not by your neighbor or a local landlord, but by Wall Street. At the same time, local laws made it harder to build affordable apartments. In many cities, zoning rules only allow single-family homes in certain areas, which means builders can't add the kinds of housing we desperately need, like duplexes or affordable apartment buildings. Here's where it all comes together. While the population has grown and the demand for housing has skyrocketed, we simply haven't built enough homes to keep up. From 2000 to 2020, housing demand grew by 26%, but new construction only increased by 19%. That gap, 7%, represents millions of people left out in the cold. And it doesn't stop there. Older generations are holding on to their homes longer, which means fewer houses are available for young families trying to buy their first one. And for renters, it's even worse. When demand goes up and supply doesn't, landlords raise the rent, and regular people are stuck paying the price. For millions of Americans, the dream of owning a home or even renting a comfortable apartment feels impossible. It's not just about statistics. It's about the human stories behind them. A generation ago, 50% of people aged 25 to 34 headed their own households. Today, that number has dropped to 40%. That's a 10-point drop in independence. A sign that an entire generation is being pushed back into their parents' homes or forced to split rents with multiple roommates just to get by.
When I was their age, I was making less than $10 an hour, and I could afford to live on my own. Now you have to be making six-figure salary to get a decent, tiny little place to live.
It's not just housing, though. Healthcare is another growing burden. The average American family spends over $12,000 annually on healthcare, nearly 20% of the median household income. A single medical emergency, an accident, an unexpected diagnosis, and a family can spiral into bankruptcy. The harsh reality? Crowdfunding platforms like GoFundMe have become a lifeline for families facing medical crises. Think about that for a moment. In one of the wealthiest nations on earth, people are turning to online donations just to survive. But housing and healthcare are just part of the story. Immigration and demographic shifts are adding another layer of complexity. States like Texas, Florida, and California are seeing explosive population growth, driven by younger, more diverse communities. While this brings energy and opportunity, it also increases pressure on housing markets that are already stretched thin. Take Austin, Texas. Once known for its affordable housing and vibrant culture, the city's population has grown by over 30% in just a decade. Housing construction hasn't kept up, driving rents sky high and pushing longtime residents out of their neighborhoods. Without access to affordable housing or the ability to build equity through home ownership, these families are trapped in a system that seems designed to keep them down. So, what's next? Is there a way out of this mess? The good news is that there are solutions. Ideas that could change the way we think about housing and affordability in the United States. The challenge is turning those ideas into action. Let's start with rent control. In places like Germany, rent control policies have kept housing costs stable by capping how much landlords can increase rent each year. This helps renters stay in their homes and prevents neighborhoods from becoming unaffordable overnight. Advocates say adopting similar policies here in the US could bring relief to millions of renters. But rent control alone isn't enough. Another big solution lies in changing the rules about what can be built.
It's a cakewalk for a home builder to take a property, demolish one small house, and then replace it with one big house.
Many cities have zoning laws that make it hard to build anything other than single-family homes. This limits the supply of affordable housing options, like duplexes or small apartment buildings. By updating these outdated laws, cities could make it easier for developers to build the kinds of homes people need. Then there's the idea of universal basic income, giving every American a guaranteed monthly payment to cover basic needs.
California legislature has just approved the nation's first state-funded guaranteed income program.
Cities like Stockton, California, have already tested UBI programs, and the results are promising. Families in these programs reported feeling less stressed, more secure, and better able to focus on things like education and career growth. And let's not forget public housing. In cities like Vienna, Austria, public housing isn't just for low-income families, it's for everyone. These homes are well-designed, well-maintained, and affordable. Imagine if we rethought public housing in the US, not as a last resort, but as a foundation for community stability. Of course, every solution has its challenges. Rent control faces pushback from landlords. Zoning reforms often meet resistance from local communities. And large-scale public housing projects require political commitment and sustained funding, two things that have been in short supply in this country. But there's one thing we can't afford to ignore: the power of people. Across the country, grassroots movements are taking a stand, demanding fair rents, stronger tenant protections, and more affordable housing options. In California, tenant unions are organizing to push back against corporate landlords. In New York, activists are fighting for stronger rent control laws. These efforts may seem small, but they're proof that change often starts from the ground up.